Hey everybody, welcome to Moment of Clarity. Thanks for joining me. Please take a minute to share this and let people know. Email your friends, click thumbs up, click subscribe, all of that good stuff. I have an incredible guest for you that we'll get to in just 1 second. Also live on Rockfin. So if you haven't subscribed over there, please do that. But yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. So big news you probably heard about. Joe Biden. I think he's, what is he, assistant to president. President Joe Biden announced that he will be withdrawing the remaining troops from Afghanistan in just a shade over 2 decades from when we invaded. He announced that it would happen by September 11th. I wonder where he found the date. What a wonderful day to remind us of. He said it would happen by September 11th, which means they're not going to make the May deadline, which is yet another deadline they've pushed back. But so to get into all this, what it means, and where it's going, and also the history of Afghanistan, which is incredibly important, and it's ignored a lot by our mainstream media and by our politicians. To do all of that, and maybe if we can squeeze in there, talk about other stories as well, I'd like to bring in the host of the Socialist program and just a great activist and political leader of sorts and reporter, Brian Becker. Brian.
Hey, Lee.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Loving the show. Everybody should check out Socialist program if they don't already. They can get it on all of those podcast platforms and everything. But yeah, I've been loving it. So I just loved your episode on Afghanistan. So Biden has announced that we're getting the troops out, and this is should we be very excited? Should anti-war activists say we did it?
Well, it's very, very, very difficult for American politicians who, usually gladly send other people's children to war to fight and to kill and to be killed in countries they don't know anything about, probably never heard of before, against people whose language they don't speak, who have a culture and a religion that they don't understand. It's very hard for the politicians who gladly send them to come to the point where they say, we actually can't succeed. We are losing militarily. That's what's happening right now with Afghanistan. The question, Trump, the Democrats denounced Trump because he said he was going to end the war in Afghanistan. They said he's soft on the Taliban. He's helping Russia, all that. Well, Biden's doing the same thing because some political leader eventually had to acknowledge the reality that America can't win the war in Afghanistan, that it's losing the war, and that, Americans are being sent there to kill and to be killed. Bombs are dropping on the people of Afghanistan, and there's no way out. So, it's like Vietnam. When Nixon came in 1969, they knew they couldn't win the war in Vietnam. But Nixon said, we have to have peace with honor, which meant that another 40,000 Americans had to die in the next 4 years before there could be a peace with honor treaty. I mean, literally, it was so that Nixon didn't want to take responsibility for losing the war in Vietnam.
They've never really defined what quote unquote winning would look like in Afghanistan. And the Afghanistan papers kind of proved, after, not that everybody didn't already know it, but that there was no real understanding of what winning was. Most of the soldiers haven't seemed to know, and furthermore, lying about the progress, right?
Yeah, I mean, when Obama came in, he said Iraq was a dumb war, Afghanistan was the smart war, and he sent 30,000 more troops. That was the surge in 2009, but then he announced they were going to come home in 2 years. I mean, it's been a ball of confusion because the U.S. actually doesn't have a defined purpose in Afghanistan, which is odd for a military endeavor that lasts 20 years and costs $2 trillion and tens of thousands of lives not to have a purpose. I mean, that's unusual. But that's the reality. In fact, when the U.S. went into Afghanistan, it was because Osama bin Laden had been given refuge by the Taliban government. And the American government, after September 11th, thousands of Americans dead. The country was angry. The country was grieving. Bush said to the Taliban, hand over Osama bin Laden to us. And the Taliban said, we'll hand them over to a third country for a trial if you provide some evidence. And to which George W. Bush and Cheney said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And they invaded Afghanistan. They knocked out the Taliban government. But the Americans didn't really care about Afghanistan, because what they really cared about was the bigger prize, which was to invade Iraq. So they sort of left Afghanistan to the side. They defeated the Taliban. They actually let them escape along with Osama bin Laden because they didn't care. It was kind of like checking a box. Like, we got hit on September 11th. We have to check the Afghan box. Yes, there were no Afghans on the planes that attacked the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. 95% of Afghans had never heard of the World Trade Center. They didn't know anything about it. They weren't involved with it. But we had to check that box. And, 20 years later, 40, 50,000 Afghans are dead. Thousands of Americans are dead. Trillions of dollars. How many, people don't know how many Americans served in Afghanistan. 800,000. They served in Afghanistan for no purpose. You wonder why there's a lot of discontent amongst military veterans who come back, who commit suicide, who have PTSD, who don't know why they were sent, who were sent over and over again. And then they turn, well, some of them are turning in a radical leftist direction, but more are turning in a very radical right-wing direction. And the majority of which are not turning in any direction, just trying to lead their lives. But 800,000 people went to Afghanistan. And for what? Now Biden is defining victory, presumably, as leaving. That's victory, leaving, and then a government of national unity, which the Taliban will undoubtedly dominate.
If maybe this is one of these things you can't prove, but what was the goal of the ruling elite in Afghanistan, other than kind of a bloodlust after 9/11? But is it part of it's creating a failed state, so it's not a country that can threaten us? Part of it is maybe the minerals that we can steal over there. Part of it is to keep it out of Russia, alliance with Russia. But I don't know if there's one that you really point to, and maybe this is where we should start to go back further in the history, if that's connected. But what's been the actual point, not the one that they tell people about, not the one they give in speeches.
Well, it's evolved over time, really. I mean, when the Americans invaded on October 7th, 2001, 3 weeks after September 11th, Afghanistan was already a failed state. The Afghan government only controlled a certain part of the Afghan territory. The Taliban controlled Kabul and some parts of the south. They didn't control the north. Those were controlled by other warlords. But Afghanistan became a failed state as a consequence of the U.S. CIA's intervention in Afghanistan in 1978, when the Afghan people dared to have a socialist government. But by socialist, what that meant in the context of Afghanistan was getting girls into schools, having a minimum wage, allowing trade unions to function legally, having a massive literacy, land reform so peasants could get something rather than being serfs, land slaves.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know this, that Afghanistan has this socialist history in the 70s, and you can see photos of a fairly successful society compared to now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the party was the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. It was a socialist party. It was a Marxist party. It was rooted in Kabul. And when they took power, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, launched what was then, up until then, the biggest CIA covert operation ever in the CIA history to dismantle the Afghan government. One, it was a socialist government. And two, Afghanistan, which has a 1,000-mile-long border with Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, had a pro-Soviet foreign policy orientation. So in the Cold War, they had to be destroyed. And if you go back, I played on my show a news clip from Dan Rather, 1980. CBS, ABC, NBC, they were all supporting the so-called Mujahideen, the holy warriors, the jihadi rebels led by Osama bin Laden. They were all heroes. Why? Because they were fighting communism. Yeah. And by communism, I mean like a socialist government that was doing basic, elementary reforms. That's where Afghanistan and how Afghanistan eventually became a failed state.
Yeah, the coverage of the Mujahideen who became Al Qaeda is truly amazing from the 80s and 90s. You can go back and find I think it's New York Times article with a photo of Osama bin Laden about him being this revolutionary hero. And then just the other day, as if to rewrite history, the CIA tweeted out a photo of their missile launchers that were used in Afghanistan, as if the Mujahideen did not become Al-Qaeda.
Exactly. Really something, right? They're sending missiles and advanced missile systems to the people who eventually attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. That's who it was. And even now, they're tweeting out, look, we did it. We sent Stinger missiles. Well, that was actually a very important moment because contrary to conventional history telling now, also known as a bunch of lies, the socialist government in Afghanistan was not losing to the Mujahideen. With the support of the Soviet Union, they had pretty much won the war, although it was a stalemate in some of the more rural areas. But the CIA sent advanced missiles to Osama bin Laden's team, the Mujahideen so-called. And these advanced Stinger missiles, you can hold them on your shoulder and you can shoot down helicopters. Eventually, the Soviets left Afghanistan, again, not because they were defeated, but Gorbachev had come in. He was adopting a new foreign policy. He was kind of giving Eastern Europe back to Western Europe. And he wanted to, stop confronting American imperialism. So they wanted to leave Afghanistan sort of as a peace offer to America, thinking maybe America would allow the Soviet Union to integrate into the world economy. No such luck. But, that's why the Soviets left. And when they left, Afghanistan broke apart. The Taliban came in 1993, 94. They took the leaders of the socialist government out of their homes because there was a negotiated end to the war. They slaughtered them. They mutilated their bodies. They hung them from lampposts. It was like big lynching party. And the Americans were kind of like, fine, like no big deal, as long as we can negotiate with you, which the Bush administration started to do over pipelines. Because, of course, Southern Central Asia, it borders Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Iran. All of this oil and natural gas flowed through Afghanistan, or could with a pipeline. So the American government was like, we're cool. The Taliban don't let girls go to school. No big deal. We have a pipeline.
And a bubbling opium trade that something like 80% of the opium produced there came to America or comes to America.
And it's became greater since the war began than at any time in Afghan history. The war really became the source of funds for Afghan farmers because the U.S. had destroyed the country, as it did Iraq, as it did Vietnam, the U.S. destroyed Korea between 1950. I mean, we go in, not we, the American government, the government that speaks in our name, destroys whole countries, and then says, wow, these are failed states, and our nation building just doesn't work for some reason. Anyway, when the Americans finally leave Afghanistan, the Afghans, whether they're from the right, the left, whatever, they're not going to be unhappy. There are dangers, though, about what's coming, because if the Taliban consolidate their control with their old style of rule, it's pretty much of a disaster, too, for people in Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's not necessarily going to be real nice that during that either. But obviously, the U.S. doesn't make any better. So then, what also came out a few weeks ago, which I also covered on Redacted, you probably covered it, was Gareth Porter's reporting on just how the Pentagon and others in I guess you could call it the deep state succeeded in stopping Trump from withdrawing the troops, which as of right after he lost the election, or after election day, he then immediately signed a draft of a memorandum to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan before the first of the year. And he was immediately met by resistance from Defense Secretary Esper and the Joint Chiefs, and they told him he can't do that. And he then fires Esper, and he still does not succeed at withdrawing troops. But to me, it's like, and everybody who hates Trump so much, which I also hate Trump, but so many people who hate Trump think anything to stop Trump from doing anything is wonderful. But it's like, imagine if that were a president you actually respected somehow, and you've got the entire military industrial complex making sure that they don't end war. It's kind of horrifying.
Yeah, indeed. And this is the thing, like, you're right. I mean, Lee, if Trump said we want peace in Korea, then the Democratic Party would say he's selling out the country. Like, even people who are like against war, who traditionally would think like, oh, ending a war that started 70 years ago probably is a good idea. We're saying like, no, that's Trump, selling out to authoritarians who are just like him. I mean, this ridiculous kind of reductionism. The reality is, if Biden succeeds doing this, and I think Biden seems to want to do it, the way he's discussing it, he said it shouldn't be condition based, which means it doesn't matter whether we're, the Taliban are taking over or not, we're leaving. He's part of one section of the American ruling class that really says, look, we lost the war. This isn't going to work, and we just have to recognize it and move on. They actually want to pivot elsewhere. Like, Biden and Obama were like, let's not keep fighting in South Asia and the Middle East. Let's fight China. And also now, like, let's fight Russia and Ukraine. Let's bring Ukraine into NATO. Like, they want to pivot towards major power conflict and not be bogged down in wars that they can't win. So Biden is part of the ruling class that says, geostrategically, you wouldn't think Biden is a big geostrategic thinker, granted, but he is part of that wing of the ruling class that says we have bigger fish to fry. Let's cut our losses. Let's move on. The Pentagon doesn't want to ever leave any place because it's like a cash cow for them. And also, as long as they're there, they have military bases, and Afghanistan shares a big border with Iran, and you can keep threatening Iran. But Biden wants to sort of come back to the JCPOA if he can. I don't know if he will be able to, because he's such an imperialist like the others that they're imposing conditions that are unacceptable to the Iranians. But the real geostrategic thing here is that Biden, reflecting Obama's foreign policy, wants to pivot away from the Middle East and endless war there and concentrate on major power conflict. So peace people, activists, anti-war people, I'm in the Answer Coalition, they shouldn't think like, oh, peace is coming. No, it's just the war is moving to another area. And it's a bigger area, and it's a more dangerous area in terms of global peace.
Well, yeah, and furthermore, I'm sure we're going to continue to drone bomb in Afghanistan, even if we withdraw the troops. So we will still be, at war with Afghanistan, even though most.
Yeah, I think that's in the Bill of Rights. That we always have the right to drone everyone everywhere.
Yeah, most of the countries we're bombing, we're not technically at war with. As similar with Trump's assassination of General Soleimani, we're not at war with Iran, if you actually, take the time to analyze it. But apparently we're still assassinating their generals. And, as you were saying, a lot of people were wondering whether we'd end up in a war with Iran. Many, like Bolton and Pompeo and Pence, it seemed gearing up for that. But Iran is far stronger than Iraq was when we invaded. And, us getting bogged down in Afghanistan, and then if we were to get bogged down in Iran as well, not to mention, of course, the millions of people that would die for no reason. But and so now, like you mentioned the JCPOA, which it's kind of amazing to watch American officials give, stipulations to allow Iran back into the deal that we tore up.
Yeah. And the Iranians are like, no, thank you. Even Obama, it was before Trump. Obama was supposed to lift the sanctions. Right? They added new sanctions. They said, well, it was for other reasons. It wasn't related to the nuclear. Well, for the Iranians who are like being deprived of food and medicine and, spare parts for their electrical system, it doesn't really matter how you categorize it. There's more sanctions. So the Iranians were already frustrated. Trump comes in and rips it up. And not only that, but tells the Europeans who wanted to stay in the deal and who wanted to do business with Iran that if they continued to do business with Iran, including buying oil from Iran, the U.S. would sanction them. And so they all capitulated to Trump. So Biden comes in and says now to the Iranians, look, I want to come back in. I'm not Trump. But you have to go back to producing uranium enrichment at 3.5% instead of 20%, which you're doing now, and then we can talk. Well, the Iranians are like, no, you come back in and meet your obligations. You lift the sanctions, and then we'll talk about whatever comes next. And obviously the Iranians are ready to talk about what comes next, but they're not going to, capitulate to Biden's demands. America is so right-wing that Biden, who wants the JCPOA, is handicapped because if he does anything that even appears to be rational and reasonable and conforming to American obligations, he'll be accused of being soft on Iran.
Yeah. Let's talk about what just happened with Israel attacking one of their nuclear facilities. I'm wondering if I'm sure you have better sources than me and have, probably know more about what exactly happened and how exactly Israel did it. But also what their goal is. Do you think their goal was to just partially to just interrupt the talks about JCPOA? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. I couldn't see you or hear you.
Oh, weird. Okay, so I just asked if you could just run down what Israel just did with attacking Iran's nuclear facility.
Yeah. So what the Israelis did, I mean, there's no absolute 100% proof, but they're not denying it. And everybody in the media says Israel detonated an explosion in a important part of Iran's civilian nuclear energy system. Like blowing up nuclear plants is like, that's a good idea. Nothing wrong there. They did it the day Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, arrived in Israel. So the first American official from Biden comes to Israel and they're like, hey, nice to see you. By the way, we just blew up the Iran's nuclear facility at the moment that your guys are in Vienna trying to negotiate a return to the JCPOA, obviously designed to sabotage it, to which Lloyd Austin says, our support for Israel is ironclad. And then the Washington Post headline is, Israel airs concerns about America's return to Iran nuclear deal. Well, it wasn't airing a concern. They blew up their nuclear facility. And again, the whole point was to make it clear that there never will be peace. That's the message that the Israelis are sending. We won't let you have peace. If you think you can have a rapprochement with America or peace with America, we're going to do everything to sabotage that. And because the MO in America is like, look, we give Israel $5 billion a year. Every year, they're the largest recipient of U.S. foreign and military aid of any country in the world.
Even connected to the COVID relief bill, we sent them another $1 billion or something.
Yeah, and Obama signed a deal giving $30 billion over the next decade for military arms when he left, and Netanyahu criticized it for not being big enough. So, but again, even though the Israeli government is doing this with the American government, humiliating Lloyd Austin, it's like our support is ironclad. Again, America's handicapped by some of its internal domestic politics, such that it really, the U.S. actually U.S. imperialism would benefit from the JCPOA, but the Israelis don't want it. And so there's muted criticism of Israel, even when it blows up a nuclear plant. Now, the Iranians came back and said, okay, we'll start enriching uranium at 60%, not 3%, not 10%, not 20%, but 60%. And they're going to do it, and they can do it. And that scares the United States because the fact of the matter is Iran has got 90 million people, very educated, lots of resources. It's a strong, powerful country, big scientific apparatus. If they want a nuclear weapon, they could have one very quickly. And that would upset the relationship of forces. Israel has about 200 nuclear bombs. Israel's not in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel doesn't allow weapons inspectors into the country. But if Iran or Israel or America's adversary had nuclear weapons, that would be a game changer. The Iranians say they don't want it, so it might be a moot question.
Yeah, I can't remember. I know you had a guest on your show, I think, an Iranian who made a great point that if Iran wanted weapons of mass destruction, whether it be chemical or nuclear, like they would have it by now, but they're really morally opposed to such a thing.
Yeah, that was Mohammad Marandi, professor at Tehran University. Yeah, if Iran is an advanced developed country. North Korea, which is a lot smaller, and completely isolated. They developed a nuclear weapon, and it was an indigenous nuclear weapon. Iran could certainly do it if it wants to. The Iranian leadership passed up what was called a fatwa, an Islamic sort of position where they weren't going to allow nuclear weapons. They said it's immoral, as you pointed out. So they say they don't want them. They don't really need them in one sense, because if there was a war between Israel and Iran, Iran would win. If there was a war between Iran and the United States, Iran would win. I mean, Iran would be like worse than Vietnam for America. And America was sure it could beat Vietnam, but it couldn't. You know, and the American people, like Biden going out of Afghanistan, this will be popular for Biden. All those families who have their kids going back routine.
Yeah.
I mean, the Americans actually don't want to go to war with Iran or Afghanistan or Iraq, and they didn't want to go to war with Vietnam or Korea. They're always dragooned into the war by their leaders. And unfortunately, patriotism sort of throws dust in the eyes of people, but Americans don't like it.
And I've heard the soldiers say that in Afghanistan, since they didn't understand really the goal, they would often go out on, I don't know if they called it missions or what, but you know, where it was to go through some town, and they basically go and sit somewhere for a few days and come back and say they did it. Because what's the point of putting your life on the line to just upend a village for reasons that no one's even telling you?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, any one of us could put ourselves in their shoes and like, do I want to die today for not even sure what? I mean, the same thing happened in Vietnam. I mean, the reason the American military couldn't win the war and even keep fighting is the soldiers stopped fighting. I mean, you know, several thousand officers got killed by their troops when the rank and file, the lieutenant would say, we're going to take this hill tonight. We'll draw enemy fire. Then we'll radio in the coordinates, and our bombers can come and bomb the enemy. And people would like shoot them in the back and go back to base and say, well, that battle's over. I mean, like, because you just don't want to die for nothing.
Yeah. And, you know, something towards the end, something like 1 out of every 3 soldiers was on heroin because it was so cheap and pure there. And on top of that, you know, who wants to go out and risk their life? So of course they're going to do drugs to try and deal with all of the horrific shit they're going through. I wanted to shift gears for a minute since this just came out today. The New York Times is reporting that a new report found that Capitol Police were told to hold back on their riot response during the January 6th insurrection. And I mean, the report apparently is pretty, pretty horrifying in its detail as to how they were told to hold back. And you compare that to, actual or you compare that to completely made up threats to the country, like Russiagate, which has been, completely debunked and collapsed and everything. And yet they spent years, and every politician and every media outlet acting like it was the greatest threat to the country. And then you have a literal insurrection of white supremacists and militia groups in the Capitol, and they're told to stand down.
Yeah. This is a trick question. Where did the Capitol Police Union have its annual banquet last year?
I don't know.
That would be the Trump International Hotel, 12 blocks away from the Capitol. The Capitol Police are all about Trump. The way police all around the country were all about Trump. And so when the FBI and the fusion centers got these reports, and they were coming in, lots of them on January 4th, there were emergency meetings. They were like, these are our people. These are our people. Because that's how they actually viewed it. And they weren't ready. One thing is, I got arrested. I made the same march. We took 100,000 people from the White House to the Capitol on September 15, 2007 to protest the war, the surge in Iraq. And the Capitol Police were out in force. They pepper sprayed us. They arrested us. They threw us down. It was brutal treatment from the Capitol Police. And we were led by Iraq war veterans coming to deliver a letter to Congress saying, don't authorize the surge. And they crushed the demonstration. Hundreds of us were arrested. And then you saw January 6th, and they were like, come on in. And then after Ashley Bobbitt was shot, they were like walking them down the stairs, holding their hands.
Holding their hands, yeah.
It was their people.
It was truly amazing to see. I remember seeing that moment live on CNN, and I was only a few blocks away, but I was like, is that cop holding that woman's hand walking down the step? I'm like, could you imagine it at any protest I've ever been to where things get violent? And of course, the cops usually start the violence, but where things get violent and the cops are holding people's hands, helping them up, helping them walk away, arresting no one.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And the fact that this was the seat of government and they knew that people were coming with guns. I mean, a lot of the people there had weapons, and they were coming to stop the certification of the election outcome. And they still were ordered, whatever you do, don't use pepper spray. Whatever you do, don't use tear gas. Don't hit anybody. Like, they hit us, they tear gas us, they pepper spray us routinely for nothing. And here you have thousands of armed white supremacists coming to stop a constitutional process from being enacted. It was like, we're not ready.
Well, I'll wrap it up with one last question. You've been doing this a long time. You've been an activist a long time, fighting to end war for a long time. But I also, and things are pretty grim. But I also think there's a lot going on across the country that's pretty exciting, pretty energetic. The workers striking, so much on that front. What is it you look to that you see promise and hope?
Well, it's kind of both grim and hopeful at the same time. I mean, humanity is facing numerous existential foundational crises, and they're multiple and they're cascading. Environment being first and foremost amongst them, climate catastrophe, the American endless war drive, and now automation and AI, which is going to wipe out 70% of the jobs that currently exist. These are crises that are coming in American society, and the current establishment can't solve these crises. So I'm looking for revolution, Lee. And people always think ahead of time, revolution is impossible until they happen. And then people look back and say, oh, that was inevitable, given how messed up things were. But I really do believe that there's you see it with the Bernie campaign, the Occupy movement, the Black Lives Matter campaign. There's an enormous energy of people who really want radical change. We have to define the change. We have to give it a clearer vision. But I think change is definitely coming because the status quo doesn't work.
Absolutely. We see it every day in every way. And you do an excellent job of covering it on the Socialist Program. As I said, I highly recommend everybody check it out. And it's just a great place to get your news. It's where I get plenty of my news. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Lee.
Yep. All right. That was Brian Becker, truly a legend. Check out the Socialist Program on anywhere you get your podcasts. It's free to listen and well worth it. They really just do great work there. So I'm gonna wrap it up here, but I also will have a new podcast episode coming out tonight or early tomorrow called Common Censored. You guys probably know that. Common Censored will come out later tonight. Then also Government Secrets. We're taping that on Friday. And new Redacted tonight, all that good stuff coming out soon. If you donated during this live stream, or if you are watching this later, you can also donate on Venmo at Lee Camp. All of that money goes to those in need, those who need a little help. We're not talking millions of dollars, but we funnel it all to those who email commoncensored@protonmail.com and say they need a little help. So it's that's how it works. And all your donations will go there. Really appreciate you guys joining, and hope you'll share this. Hope you'll let people know. And I will see you again tomorrow night, because I do these. Tomorrow night I have Ajamu Baraka on, by the way. He's also incredible. And I do these every single weekday, except sometimes. And you can get them all at leecamp.com. Keep fighting.